In 1870, a surveyor working for the U.S. government recorded something that would later seem almost impossible. Traveling through the upper Midwest, he described forests so dense that sunlight rarely reached the ground. Trees stood centuries old, their trunks massive, their canopies layered in complex tiers. Fallen logs lay undisturbed, slowly returning to soil. Underneath, younger generations of trees grew in uneven clusters, shaped by gaps in the canopy rather than straight lines. It was not a uniform landscape. It was irregular, chaotic, alive. These observations were not unusual for the time. Early forestry reports, preserved in institutions like the United States Forest Service, consistently describe pre-industrial forests as complex ecosystems, multi-aged, multi-layered, and largely unmanaged by modern standards. There was no symmetry, no clear spacing, no standardized growth. Then something changed. By the early 20th century, large portions of those same forests had been cut down. Logging operations expanded rapidly across North America. Railroads made remote areas accessible. Timber became one of the most valuable resources in a growing industrial nation. In response, governments began to rethink forests, not as ecosystems, but as resources to be managed. The concept of scientific forestry gained traction, influenced heavily by European models. Forests would no longer be left to grow unpredictably. They would be planned, measured, controlled. Trees would be planted in rows. Species would be selected for yield. Growth cycles would be optimized. The forest became something closer to a system. This shift is well documented. By the early 1900s, forestry schools were established. Manuals were written. Policies were implemented. The goal was sustainability, not in the modern ecological sense, but in terms of continuous timber production. Cut, replant, harvest again. The result was a new kind of forest. Orderly, predictable, efficient. If you walk through many forests today, particularly in parts of the United States or Germany, you may notice something subtle. Trees often appear evenly spaced, similar in height, sometimes even the same species. The ground is relatively clear. There are fewer fallen logs, less undergrowth. It feels organized. At first glance, this might seem natural. After all, forests grow, compete, and self-regulate. Trees of similar age often cluster together. But compare modern managed forests to descriptions from the 19th century, and a pattern emerges. Something is different. The diversity is reduced. The structure is simplified. The randomness is gone. Perhaps this is simply the result of human management. After all, large-scale logging followed by replanting would naturally produce forests of similar age and composition. The simplest explanation is often correct. But the shift goes deeper than appearance. In older accounts, forests were described not just as collections of trees, but as layered systems. There were towering canopy trees, mid-level growth, shrubs, fungi, decomposing wood, and a constant cycle of death and regeneration. Today, in many managed forests, that layering is diminished. Dead wood is often removed. Underbrush is controlled. Tree density is regulated. The forest becomes cleaner, easier to navigate, easier to harvest, and easier to misunderstand. Because when complexity is reduced, certain processes become less visible. Soil formation changes. Water retention shifts. Wildlife patterns adapt. The forest still exists, but it behaves differently. In Europe, particularly in countries like Germany, this transformation happened even earlier. Forests were heavily managed for centuries, shaped by economic and political needs. By the 19th century, large portions of Central European forests had already been converted into structured timber systems. Straight rows, uniform growth, predictable yield. The model was effective,
and it spread. In North America, the transition happened later but faster. Vast old-growth forests were cleared within decades. What replaced them was not the same system that had existed before. It was something new, something designed. This is not hidden history. It is taught in forestry programs, documented in environmental studies, acknowledged in conservation efforts. And yet, for many people walking through a forest today, the assumption remains that what they are seeing is natural, an untouched landscape, a preserved ecosystem. But in many cases, it is neither. It is a reconstruction, a simplified version of something that once existed at a much larger scale. Maybe it was necessary. Population growth required resources. Timber built cities. Managed forests prevented total deforestation. All of that is true. Still, when you compare historical descriptions to modern landscapes, a quiet question begins to form. Not about what was added, but about what was removed. Because if forests were once more complex, more layered, more irregular than they are now, what exactly is missing from the forests we see today?
What is missing is not immediately obvious. At a distance, modern forests still appear dense. Green canopies stretch across hills and valleys. From above, they resemble continuous ecosystems, vast and uninterrupted. But the closer you look, the more the differences begin to organize themselves into patterns. In pre-industrial forests, tree ages varied widely within the same area. Some trees were centuries old, towering above younger generations that had grown in their shadow. When an old tree fell, it created a gap in the canopy, allowing light to reach the forest floor. That gap became an opening, a microenvironment, a place where new life could emerge in irregular bursts. Today, in many managed forests, that process is minimized. Trees are often planted at the same time, harvested at the same time, replaced at the same time. The result is uniformity. Not absolute, but noticeable. Rows, spacing, predictability. Dead wood is another absence. Historically, fallen trees remained where they collapsed. They decayed slowly, supporting fungi, insects, and microorganisms. These decomposing logs played a critical role in nutrient cycling, gradually returning organic matter to the soil. In many modern forests, dead wood is removed, sometimes for safety, sometimes for aesthetics, sometimes to reduce fire risk. The forest floor becomes clearer, simpler, less cluttered, but also less complex. Wildlife patterns follow these changes. Species that depend on old growth conditions, large hollow trees, dense underbrush, or decaying wood often decline when those features disappear. In contrast, species that thrive in open or uniform environments may increase. The forest does not vanish, it shifts, quietly, gradually. Another difference lies in species composition. Pre-industrial forests often contained a wide variety of tree species within relatively small areas. Diversity created resilience. If one species declined, others could fill ecological roles. Managed forests frequently favor a smaller number of species, selected for growth rate, wood quality, or economic value. Pine, spruce, Douglas fir. Efficient choices, but limited ones. This is particularly visible in parts of Germany, where large areas of forest were historically converted into monocultures, single-species stands designed for timber production. Similar patterns appear in regions of the United States, especially where industrial logging has been followed by replanting programs. The forests grow back, but they do not grow back the same way. Fire plays a role as well. In many ecosystems, periodic fires were once part of the natural cycle. They cleared underbrush, recycled nutrients, and created space for new growth. Indigenous land management practices often used controlled burns to maintain these cycles.
Modern fire suppression policies interrupted that pattern. For decades, fires were extinguished as quickly as possible. The intention was protection of timber resources, of communities, of infrastructure. But the long-term effect was accumulation. Fuel built up, underbrush thickened. When fires did occur, they were often more intense, more destructive. Another layer of difference: fire, suppression, accumulation, release. And then there is the visual quality. People often describe modern forests as peaceful, orderly, accessible. You can walk through them with relative ease. Trails are clear, sight lines extend further. The environment feels stable. But early accounts describe something else: difficulty, density, uncertainty. Forests that were harder to navigate, harder to see through, filled with irregular growth and uneven terrain. That difference is subtle but important. A forest that is easy to walk through is often a forest that has been shaped, not necessarily damaged, but adjusted. At this point, a different kind of idea sometimes appears, less about forestry practices and more about historical interpretation. A small number of alternative researchers suggest that the scale of old-growth forests described in early accounts may have been even greater than currently understood, and that their rapid disappearance in the 19th century reflects not just logging, but a broader environmental shift that is not fully documented. The suggestion varies. Sometimes it focuses on climate, sometimes on land use, sometimes on the possibility that early descriptions captured ecosystems that no longer have modern equivalents. There is little concrete evidence supporting more dramatic versions of this idea. Mainstream ecology attributes the changes to well-documented processes: industrial logging, land clearing, replanting, and long-term management practices. The simplest explanation is often correct. Still, the perception persists that something about older forests, something described consistently in early accounts, is difficult to fully reconstruct today. Not because it is hidden, but because it no longer exists at scale. And absence can be difficult to measure, especially when the replacement looks, at first glance, almost identical. Trees are still there. Canopies still form, the forest still appears, but the structure beneath that appearance has changed. And once you begin to notice that change, it becomes harder to ignore, because it suggests that what we call a forest today may not be the same kind of system that existed before.
There is a difference between something being gone and something being replaced. A clear-cut forest is visibly absent. The loss is immediate, obvious, measurable. But a transformed forest is more complicated. It still looks like a forest, it still functions in many ways like a forest, and yet it carries a different internal structure, one shaped not only by natural processes, but by deliberate human decisions made over generations. This creates a quiet kind of ambiguity, because memory tends to attach itself to appearances. If the trees are there, the assumption follows that the system is intact. But systems are more than what they look like from a distance. They are patterns, relationships, cycles that unfold over long periods of time. In many parts of the United States and Germany, efforts are now underway to restore aspects of older forest structures. Conservation programs reintroduce dead wood into ecosystems. Selective logging replaces clear-cutting. Mixed species planting is encouraged. Even controlled burns are being reconsidered. Carefully, gradually. These efforts are based on a recognition that something was lost, not entirely, but enough to alter how forests behave, not just in terms of biodiversity, but in resilience. Old-growth forests, as described in early records, were not simply collections of large trees.
They were systems that had developed over centuries, shaped by disturbances, regeneration, decay, and growth. They contained memory, not in a symbolic sense, but in structure, layers built over time. When those layers are removed, the forest does not disappear, but its history does. And rebuilding that history is not simple. A newly planted forest may take decades to mature, centuries to resemble what came before. Some elements may never fully return. Certain fungal networks, specific microhabitats, the subtle interactions between species that evolved together over long periods. Maybe it was inevitable. Industrial societies required timber, land needed to be cleared, cities needed to expand. The transformation of forests was part of a broader shift in how humans interacted with the environment, from coexistence to management, from observation to control. And yet, the language we use has not fully adapted. We still call these landscapes forests, which is not incorrect, but it may be incomplete, because the word carries assumptions about wildness, about continuity, about something untouched that do not always apply. Maybe I'm connecting dots that were never meant to touch. It is possible that modern forests are simply different, not lesser, adapted to new conditions, shaped by human presence in ways that reflect the realities of the present rather than the past. That perspective has its own validity, but it does not erase the historical record. Descriptions of forests that were denser, more irregular, more layered than what most people experience today. Accounts of ecosystems that functioned in ways we are still trying to understand. And perhaps that is where the unease lingers. Not in the idea that something has been hidden, but in the recognition that something has been simplified, gradually, systematically, often with good intentions, until the simplified version became the new baseline and the original complexity became harder to imagine. Today, when you walk through a forest, it is easy to feel that you are seeing something ancient, something unchanged. But in many cases, what you are seeing is relatively young, structured, managed, a landscape that carries only fragments of what once defined it. The rest exists in scattered old growth remnants, protected areas, and written descriptions preserved in archives. Pieces of a system that was once continuous, now separated, reduced, remembered. And if those fragments were ever to disappear completely, the word forest would remain, but the thing it once described would exist only in records, descriptions of layered canopies, fallen giants, and dense, uneven growth that no longer quite matches what stands in their place.